Yeah, I got to say,
Mm.
transitioning and looking kind of more male to the casual observer has really driven home to me how much casual sexism there is because I experience a
Mm.
lot less of it now.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, neurodivergence, disability, kink, mental health, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you appreciate this podcast and want to support us, visit our website 50shadesofgender.com, as in FIFTY, to make a donation, find out more about our allyship course and workshops, and details of how to join our community. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Ray Briggs, Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University, co-host of the radio show Philosophy Talk, and co-author of the book What Even Is Gender? Ray's pronouns are they, them, he, him is also okay, and they are genderqueer, boy, and also a practicing bisexual and T4T. Find out what that means to Ray in this episode. We also talk about ways to be queer, the expansiveness of the term bisexual, philosophy and decision-making, ignoring possibilities, the essence of womanhood or lack thereof, testosterone's physical and emotional effects, how to define aggression, consent policies, and being impossible. Please be aware that there is brief mention of sexual assault statistics in this episode. It was recorded on the 24th of August 2023. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Ray Briggs, R.A. Briggs on the book jacket. Yeah,
Yeah,
pleased to meet you, Esther.
pleased to meet you. Yeah. So you mentioned your book, which has been, it's called What Even Is Gender, isn't it?
Yes, it's
Yes,
by
yeah.
me and a co-author, B.R. George.
And when did that come out?
So that came out just this year in June.
Mm-hmm.
It is available both as a physical book and for free open access on the publisher's website, on Routledge's website.
Oh, interesting. Cool. Yeah, so let's talk about that as well. So first though, the labels you gave me for this episode were genderqueer, a boy with an I, practicing bisexual, and T for T, which is great. We haven't talked about T for T yet on the podcast, so
Oh wow, that's a surprise.
yeah, no. I mean, I'm familiar with the term. It's trans for trans, isn't it? So
Yes.
let's start with. I mean, where do you want to start? We can start with that one, or we.
Yeah, let's start with T for
Yeah,
T.
yeah.
Uh,
So what does that mean
so
to you? Yeah.
yeah, so that kind of started out as a Craigslist category back when Craigslist had personals.
Oh.
So you could be like M for F, M for M, T for T. It's a little weird to have T as its own gender given how people carve up genders now, because like plenty of trans people are also men or women. So that was just sort of the weirdness of how, I don't know, 90s Craigslist and 2000s Craigslist behaved. And so it got kind of taken up by Tori Peters, and she says that it actually got taken up by like a group of trans women that she knew in New York. So Tori Peters is famous now for Detransition Baby, which is one of her later
Ah.
novels, which I love. But she also wrote some earlier novels, including Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones, where the characters tattoo T for T on themselves.
Yeah, I've heard of the book Detransition Baby. I haven't read it yet, but yeah, I think another guest of mine mentioned it as well. It might have been Brian. Let me anyway. I'll refer back to that. But you really love it, do you?
I
Yeah.
love it. I kind of love basically all of Tori Peters' work. I think she's a really talented novelist, and it's so cool
Mm,
to see her getting mainstream uptake. But yeah, I
amazing.
told you like the history of T for T, but I didn't tell you what it really means to me.
Oh, please continue.
Yeah, so I am uh, I'm pretty much only dating trans people at this point in my life. Have no real interest to change that, and also I just like I like my fellow trans people apart from the like sex and romance aspects. I want love and support to be part of trans people's relationships with each other.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Is that something that I mean, how long have you been feeling this way? And have you dated cis people in the past and thought, nah, I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think I had only dated cis people until my mid 30s, when I got a divorce.
Wow,
And
yeah. Mm.
I started doing a bunch of things at once. So up until that point, I'd been trying to function as a straight woman. And I kind of did the actions okay, didn't feel the feelings as I was supposed to.
Hmm.
Um, and so once I was divorced, I thought, I have permission to do anything I want. Let me try to do the opposite of what I was doing before. And it kind
Mm.
of worked
See
much
how it
better.
goes. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, gosh. So, I mean, what about I feel like this is very much going to be a conversation of a very fluid one, but there you go. Um,
I like
so
fluidity. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So how long have you been like if we go to the gender queer and maybe boy as well, how long have you been like say aware of anything like queerness and gender and stuff like that and yeah, what's the background there?
So, I mean, I think I was aware of queerness in some form from a pretty young age. Like, I was born in the early 80s, grew up in the 80s and 90s, and my family were like fairly liberal. They acknowledged that they were gay people. There were gay people, and that it's okay to be gay. So, like, that was part of my upbringing. I did not think of myself as a queer person
Mm-hmm.
for a very long time. It's interesting. I had a really close friend who I met when I was 15, who is a trans woman, and whose coming out process I kind of like knew her through.
Mm,
So we dated for a while and assumed that we were a straight couple, which is
interesting.
kind of
Yeah.
cool. And we've stayed
Mm-hmm.
in each other's lives kind of since then.
Mm-hmm. That was before she was out as well, you mean?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so she came out as genderqueer, which I think is no longer a term that she identifies with, but that
Mm-hmm.
was sort of her first queer identity,
Mm-hmm.
like when we were in our mid 20s, I think. And so that
Mm-hmm.
was how I learned the word genderqueer.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like I didn't really think I had learned a new thing about my friend. I thought I had learned a new concept that kind of
Mm.
fits the experience I've been having with my friend.
Mm. Interesting. So what you were just saying, I was going to revisit that, is a bit like you've always had a sense of like gender, like non-conformity, maybe, however you want to call it, but also you didn't consider yourself a queer person. So those were
Uh,
those like different concepts for you? Like how did they eventually like meet,
I
perhaps?
mean, so when I was growing up, the ways you could be queer were to be like gay, lesbian, or bisexual.
Yeah.
I knew that I was attracted to like boys my age, so I assumed that I was straight because I was like,
Mm.
well, I am a girl. I am attracted to boys. Those are those
That's
are
that's
the
yeah.
criteria.
Yeah, right.
And I in fact, I had some interactions with girls my age that, like, in retrospect, I'm like, oh, those probably count as crushes, but I
Mm.
didn't interpret them that way at the time. And I don't know, maybe I'm projecting backwards. um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly since had things relating to women that definitely count as crushes and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't had a relationship with anybody who wasn't a man, like, until I got divorced, basically. Well, I guess except for my friend Lexi, who I thought was a man at the time.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Was that your first relationship as such? Or your first maybe romantic or sexual relationship?
No, my first romantic relationship actually was with a boy in my high school who has since come out as gay, which in some
Interesting.
sense is gratifying.
Yeah, that makes total sense, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what does it mean to you to be, the term boy? I'm intrigued by the BOI and how,
Right.
how it's written and like what does that mean to you?
Right. So I think I really like the concept of boy spelled however.
Mm,
Boys were the first people who I was attracted to when I was a teenager. Like, that means, like, I'm not attracted to kids. I'm attracted to people my own age. But
Mm.
I think there's a kind of youthfulness that even in my 40s, like there's a kind of, I don't know, Peter Pan-ness to the idea of a boy. The I think specifies that I have a certain kind of gender history. It's interesting. I have occasionally seen men who have a penis and were born with a penis refer to themselves as boy, like on the internet, which I'm not going to police. But I was like, oh, I didn't expect that was that what that meant.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and I also like, so I think of boy as a kind of like transmasculine category. I think
Mm.
one question you might have about boy, and that I thought about, is like, so this is definitely a word that is used a lot among black queer people, and I am white, I am not black, but it feels like general enough that I can acknowledge and use the word, whereas like
Mm.
something like stud I would not feel comfortable identifying as, because I'm like, that's not my word.
Mm.
So
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another label that you list is practicing bisexual. So it kind of makes sense from what you've said, like, the gender journey and then the attractions and like separating the two out. It must be really confusing because I think when I was younger, I was also familiar with, like the sexuality, like non-conformity, if you will,
Mhm.
like being gay, lesbian, bi, even. And I just, yeah, I had never really come across a trans person or even the concept of a trans person until I can't even remember. It must have been in my 20s at the earliest, maybe even after that. I don't know. So, yeah, like separating those journeys out. I mean, it must be quite confusing, like an internal, like, how does this fit together and what is this even? And is this one thing? And I don't know. How
Yeah,
do you
so
feel about that?
I don't think that I have felt super confused about it.
Okay.
So the great thing about the label bisexual is that it doesn't label my gender. And I think if I
Mm,
were attracted only to men, or like men and similar, or only to women or women and similar, like that, then I would be like, oh, I don't have a label that is widely understood that accurately reflects who I am. But
mm,
bisexual doesn't have that problem,
mm,
which is very nice. And so if you meet the sufficient condition of really liking people of different genders, like, oh, that's like confirmation that you are bisexual. I should also say like maybe a little something about bisexual versus pansexual.
yeah, yeah. So that's interesting, especially with the T4T and how you feel like how you date at the moment. Yeah. So like the bisexual for you. One time I had a conversation with someone on the pod, and they were talking about bisexual as being attracted, well, to two genders or more, but
Mm.
also the two genders, the two main genders that people are attracted to, don't necessarily need to be binary genders. And I was like, wow, that blew my mind a little bit. And I was a bit like, yeah, I hadn't even considered that before.
Yeah,
So
I really like that
yeah.
interpretation. So I mean, it's kind of a retcon. So really, what I think about the word bisexual is that it came to existence at a time where most people were just making these very binary assumptions about which genders there were.
Yeah.
So it wasn't to distinguish you from people who are attracted to non-binary people. Non-binary people sort of wasn't on the radar.
Yeah.
If you read some of the stuff by like early bisexual activists, some of them are also like Ricky Wilchins or Kate Bornstein. Like they're also sort of either non-binary or like in like pretty non-binary territory,
Mm.
and they do acknowledge that there's gender complication, and bisexual is sort of the word that they reach for to label their sexual attractions, because pansexual is not a word that's been invented yet.
Mm.
And so that's the history I kind of want to connect to, is
Ah,
like, oh,
okay.
there's this like old history of bisexuality where it's not a super binary concept. And I don't really think like we need a word for fetishizing binary gender, because I don't think we need that thing.
Mm.
Like,
Mm.
so I'm happy to count myself as bisexual. Pansexual is also a fine word. It's an accurate word, and it's a word that
Mm.
I'm happy to use. I think
Mm.
bisexual was the thing that people got made fun of for being when I grew up. So I feel a little bit of attachment to it for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah, I wanted to sort of go in the direction of like what you do. So you're a professor of philosophy,
I am.
and yeah, so how do you feel? Is this a subject like multiple sort of questions in here? But like, is this something you've always been interested in, and has the subject of philosophy been helpful to you in like your gender journey or your sexuality journey or like your identity journey in general?
Yes and yes. I love philosophy. I took an intro philosophy class as an undergrad, and I just kind of fell in love with it. And I basically I went to the philosophy department and I took all the classes that I could, and I like hung out in the lounge. And the grad students were very kind to me, and the professors were very kind to me, and they let me ask them my obsessive questions about the texts we were reading.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how long can I stick around in philosophy departments before I get kicked out? And I'm still waiting for that to happen. So
Yeah.
years it turns
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Wow.
And I didn't start out studying anything to do with gender, and I still have a lot of other interests as well. I was obsessed with metaphysics because it was really weird,
Mm.
and I got a bit obsessed with decision theory in grad school, partly because there was a professor I really admired who knew a lot about decision theory, and I
Mm.
wanted us to be able to have good academic conversations. So I
Gosh.
studied a lot of decision theory.
Decision theory. That sounds, is it kind of, does it do what it sounds like? Is
It
that what
super
it?
doesn't.
So I'm like, I don't know what that is, but yeah.
It's basically it's kind of a bunch of mathematical apparatus
Mm.
related to statistics
Okay.
that helps you describe decision making principles. Whether those
Mm.
are applicable to everyday decisions is a little bit dicey some of the time,
Mm.
because um, a lot of them are kind of computationally demanding.
Mm.
And when you are making a decision about what to have for lunch, you don't necessarily want to do something computationally demanding. You just want to make a quick decision without too much effort and get lunch.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because that just makes me think of like neurodivergence and like how even simple decisions can be really like not simple at all, like
Yeah.
yeah, depends on how your brain works, I suppose.
There's a really interesting literature coming out of business schools and psychology about kind of bounded rationality. And economists are also interested in bounded rationality. So that's, how do I make a rational decision if I don't have forever to cogitate on it?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so I know less about that than I want to, but
Yeah.
it's kind of a way to maybe bridge the gap a little bit between nerds
Mm.
with their like very computationally demanding ideas of how you would make a perfectly rational decision,
Mm.
and people actually trying to make a decision in a limited amount of time without burning their brains out.
Yeah. Sounds like something I'd be interested in. Indeed. And it's like how emotions come into decision making, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
isn't it like the emotions affect decision making like a lot? Um,
they
and
do. And
that's,
there's a
yeah.
whole, there are like whole other fields of philosophy and psychology of emotion as
Mm.
well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's why they use certain sales techniques or even words or all that stuff because it speaks to the emotional part of the brain or something like that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, the decision making part is not the rational part necessarily. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, as you can probably tell.
Yeah,
There you
so
go.
like I feel like there are
Yeah,
so many cans of worms, and
I know, right?
rationality and emotion
Yeah,
is another one. I'm
yeah.
definitely sort of with the school of philosophers who think emotion and rationality are not opposed.
Mm,
Emotion is one source of information that
mm,
can be extremely valuable in figuring out what is
yeah,
significant in your environment and what to do about it.
yeah. I like that. So, yeah, about your book, what made you decide to, write about the subject of gender? And what is the main, obviously, recommending to people to have a read of the book. What is your main takeaway? Like, from your experience of writing it and researching it and stuff, what would you say is the main thing you learned about gender?
Ooh, so many of the things I learned are like little annoying nerd things that you don't need to get the main takeaway of the book, actually.
Yeah.
I think I do want to say the main takeaway of the book, which is
Yeah.
that we're trying to use philosophical tools to expand people's ideas of what is possible
Mm.
and encourage people to be kind of more imaginative. I think sometimes people can use philosophical techniques to cut down on the range of possibilities, and sometimes
Mm.
it's okay to cut down on the range of possibilities if you know that a possibility is not going to be actual, or if you know that a scenario is not really even possible, then maybe it makes sense to ignore it for practical purposes. But I think too much ignoring of possibilities limits you.
Mm.
And so my co-author and I have seen a lot of ignoring and dismissing of like genuine gender possibilities.
Ooh,
And so a
interesting.
big part of the purpose of the book is to like give people some ways to expand which possibilities they admit.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So are there any like insights you had about your own gender or your own gender journey from, the experience of writing the book?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I think so. I have a lot of confidence now that the things I want and the things I feel are in fact coherent. And I don't know how
Mm.
much of that came from sort of writing the book and thinking through, like, let's make an argument, and how much of
Mm.
it came from just living around people who were kind to me and saw me.
Mm.
Um, I definitely think that having my co-author to talk back and forth with for years and years has been incredibly like valuable and confidence boosting. But yeah, a part of the book I think is also to just like offer the kind of solidarity and fellowship to like other trans nerds that I
Yeah.
want in the world.
Yeah, totally. Wow. Yeah. So I had a look at the one thing I've started doing, like I seem to be speaking to a lot of authors, and that kind of makes sense to me. And because a lot of, I think, trans folks just want to live their lives and they just want to be left alone for the most part. But people who've written books also want to, get their books out. So it makes
Yes.
sense that people who are authors want to chat about this in more detail, or in the spotlight in a way. So your dedication in the book really stood out, and it says, for everyone who's ever been told they were impossible. And yeah, I just really love that. What inspired those words?
So this was my co-author's suggestion. They are really verbally brilliant and just really brilliant.
Mm.
So we floated around a bunch of different ideas, and I saw that one and said, "Oh yes, that's correct," because there's a kind of double meaning. So
Mm.
in one sense, you are impossible means you're perfectly possible, but you're frustrating me. I don't
Right.
like you.
Uh-huh.
So you're impossible can mean that, but it can also mean so this thing you report where you say that you're not a woman and yet you want to wear dresses, like that's not a permissible combination of desires. And
Mm.
so one of the big things in the book is saying you don't have to match. Like you don't have to have your gender category match like how you want your body to look or how your body does look, and that doesn't
Mm.
have to match sort of which kinds of cultural practices you engage in or how you dress. Like these things
Mm.
are all separate, and it's okay to separate them both in like reality and in your desires and your imagination.
Yeah, because you mentioned as well, like the concept of gender identity. You say it's dangerously overburdened, and it's like, yeah, about
Yeah.
presentation and identity and stuff. And I think there's a lot of pressure on gender non-conforming folks to still conform to certain stereotypes, or they're seen in a particular way. So they're, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of our kind of central ideas in the book
Mm.
is this pressure to be like one coherent thing that is coherent by this very restrictive set of rules that were kind of made up by cis people.
Mm. Totally. And in chapter, I think it's chapter 5, where you say there is no essence of womanhood. That's another thing that stood out for me. And I found it really fascinating because I've been thinking about the experience of womanhood. And I think a few episodes ago, wherever that was, I don't remember exactly, but I was in a place where I was like, okay, maybe there's like a universal experience of womanhood, and then there's an individual experience of womanhood. But the more I think about that, the more I'm like, there is no universal experience of womanhood. That doesn't exist because it's so unique and individual for every person, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this chapter is kind of a bit of a response to this idea that you have to define womanhood
Mm.
if you want trans women to have space to exist, and we just don't think that that's a reasonable
Mm.
demand. A lot of like cis feminist philosophers have also noticed this. They've noticed that like attempts to define womanhood often end up defining it in terms of like a certain type of middle class white woman.
Right.
But there are lots of different types of women, not all of whom look like anybody's stereotype of womanhood. And so it's not really clear that there's one thing that all women have in common,
Mm-hmm.
even if there are kind of broad commonalities that like there are like features such that I can name them that like most women have them, or like most women, or sorry, most non-women don't have them. They don't
Mm.
kind of add up to a single essence. So we kind of
Mm.
start from definitions are probably, sorry, let me start that sentence over. So we
Yeah.
kind of start from a lot of the definitions that people offer are pretty inadequate. And then most of our work is, so how do we understand gender categories without necessary and sufficient conditions?
Mm-hmm.
And so other philosophers have come up with models for this, and thought like a lot of categories don't have meaningful, necessary, and sufficient conditions. And so we're in this kind of long philosophical tradition of like what else can you do to analyze a concept.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting because in a way I was a bit like this whole idea and question of, oh, what is a woman and define woman and all that stuff. It's it's probably a question that especially philosophers have probably asked themselves for a long time. But also I feel like it's never been so much at the surface then like when it's all about trans women in the media and the grief they get for like pretty much everything, all of a sudden it seems like it's another gotcha question, isn't it?
Oh
Oh well,
yeah.
define woman so we can invalidate your existence. Do you know what I mean? It's like that, you know?
Yeah, I think it's often not being asked in good faith.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if someone would ask, perhaps like in context, like a cis woman, like define womanhood or like prove that you're a woman, I'd be like, well, fuck off, basically. It's none of your
It's a
business.
great response.
So yeah,
I
right.
think
I
that's
thought
the right
so.
answer.
So yeah, and but all of a sudden, it's all about trans women, and then now they have to defend womanhood, and it's like it seems like such a big, not even a big ask, it's like impossible, to define this thing. And they've got plenty of like labor to do in that way, and emotional labor and all that kind of stuff, and societal labor as such in the first place, like to begin with. So yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, one of my kind of quick, maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek observations is that the amount of misogyny that trans women get definitely
Mhm.
supports the conclusion that trans women are women, because there's a
Right.
lot of freaking misogyny.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it just makes us all more aware, I think, of the day-to-day misogyny and the stuff that I grew up with that was just considered, oh, normal, and all this boys will be boys bullshit. And it's good to see that is changing now. And yeah, I mean, we've got a long way to go though. But yeah, there's just so much of it, and it's just the stuff that we've been taught to. Oh, just brush that off. Oh, don't worry about that. Don't worry. That's normal. What is normal in the end.
Yeah, I gotta say,
Mm.
transitioning and looking kind of more male to the casual observer has really driven home to me how much casual sexism there is, because I experience a
Mm.
lot less of it now.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I've heard. I've heard people say that, and like trans men especially have said that as well. Like all of a sudden they get more respect, or they get more, it's just, it can be very subtle, but also can be very like prominent in what they notice,
Yeah.
you know?
It's kind of nice, but it's also really gross.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah. What else would you say? Like how has that shown up for you? I'd love to know more about that and how that's been for you.
So one of the big things is that I don't get sexually harassed by random people on the street pretty much ever, and partly I kind of aged out of that,
Hmm.
but also partly I think I masculinized out of that.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, I do think that people assume that I know what I'm talking about more often now.
Hmm.
And I do often know what I'm talking about. Like, I'm a nerd who likes to study stuff, but I, the
That's
testosterone did
good.
not make me smarter. It just didn't.
That's funny. Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned testosterone. Are you happy to talk a bit more about that? I was
Yeah,
wondering
sure.
about, what made you decide to go down the route of taking testosterone, and when that happened, and what's that done for you besides what you've just described.
Yeah, so I was curious about taking testosterone, and I started in 2017. And I was also nervous. I was like, is this going to make me really aggressive? Because I don't want to be
Yeah.
aggressive and mean to people.
Mm.
Is it going to feel awful? So I went on an extremely low dose. And after months of this, I thought, this is doing nothing. It's a little frustrating. I would like to increase my dose. And so I increased my dose, and I really enjoy the physical effects. Someday I will be able to grow proper facial hair. Right now I have a little bit of scraggly facial hair. I'm
Hmm.
very excited about the little bit of facial and body hair I have.
Yeah.
I don't think I have the genetics to to really be a very like hairy person.
Hmm.
But it's fun to be a little bit hairy. I love what it's done to my voice. Like
Hmm.
I love having a deeper voice. I love trans voices. Yeah, so I do like what it's done to my like physical appearance in terms of voice and hair and fat distribution and getting a
Mm.
little more muscle on my scrawny frame. um,
Yeah.
so all of the physical changes I think are my main reason for taking it and kind of my favorite things about it.
Hmm.
Emotionally, I have not felt the kind of dramatic changes that I was afraid of.
Mm.
So I am still not a super angry person.
Mm.
I can be angry sometimes, but I think that really started after my divorce and before I started taking testosterone, and was mostly
Interesting.
the result of like a little bit of emotional work on myself and reflection rather than a physical change.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
it is physically harder to cry on testosterone, which is super weird, and
Interesting.
is the one most dramatic, like emotional effect. I kind of like it. I didn't enjoy crying as much as I did before I was on testosterone. Like it
Mm.
felt physically really unpleasant. And it was annoying because I couldn't turn it off. Like I couldn't not cry if I was feeling emotional, and I didn't want people to see me crying. It felt like I was drawing
Mm.
attention to myself that I just did not appreciate or want, which made me cry more.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah.
And so being able to not cry sometimes, even if I'm feeling dramatic emotions, is kind of
Mm.
great. If I could turn the knob to an ideal setting, I think it would be probably like slightly easier to cry than it is now, but harder to cry than it was before testosterone. And I
Hmm.
can't get exactly that without sort of changing other things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting, actually. But I've heard about your concerns about the aggression and stuff. I think it's a common concern, maybe with testosterone. One of my previous guests, Joris, he described that, and he was like, "Oh my god, am I going to get really aggressive?" And he said, "Actually, I just became really chilled." It's like,
Yeah.
ah, yeah. So that was funny.
Yeah, I
Ah,
think I think I'm generally pretty chill. I think a little bit more chill than I was before testosterone, but also it's so
mm,
hard to disentangle all of those. Yeah, it's interesting because like
yeah.
also I think aggression is a thing that can happen, but it's also very dosage dependent. Like this is why
Mm.
you don't want people going on huge amounts of steroids, because you put enough testosterone in somebody and they will be aggressive. But
Mm.
I think it's more than sort of certainly I'm taking or the typical cis man produces in his body.
Mm.
And I don't really know the research on testosterone well, but there's like, I understand that in the levels that sort of typical cis men have in their body, like that range of testosterone levels, testosterone doesn't actually correlate very well with aggression at all.
Mm. Interesting. I wonder really if it has anything to do, I'm sure it does actually, like to do with emotions and suppressed emotions and stuff like that as well. And like if you have to suppress certain emotions, they're bound to like bubble under the surface and every now and then erupt, you know? So
Yeah, that could
kind of
be. Like
kind of
it
makes
it
total
seems like there are
sense.
so many factors going
Yeah.
into sort of. Also, I'm now thinking I have a colleague who's retired now, Helen Longino, but one of her research topics was the concept of aggression and how scientists measure it, and how it
Interesting.
often builds in a lot of value assumptions, like what
Mm.
counts as aggression, where studies will count things like swearing as aggression. And I swear sometimes I don't think
Interesting.
it's that aggressive. And it doesn't hurt people. Like it is not
Yeah.
automatically harmful to swear, even if it can be in a context. And
Yeah.
then something like giving people unsafe water because it saved you a couple of cents doesn't usually count as aggression or violence, even though it's super damaging. I'm thinking about
Ooh.
sort of Flint, Michigan, and how the.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah, that's such a good point. Like, how do you define it to begin with? And then you have to really go back like several steps, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of the gap between something like an emotion of anger and the action of hurting people has so many steps in it
Yeah.
that I've also sort of been thinking about. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that even though, so I would say that I am now able to feel a normal human amount of anger, and it's pretty healthy. Um, but like
Yeah.
I don't hurt people because of it, and testosterone doesn't make somebody hurt people because of it.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
we still, humans have decision making capabilities. Also, I don't really want to hurt people.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because, like you say, with swearing, isn't it? You can. I love swearing, to be honest. It's like a release valve for me, and I live on my own, so I do tend to walk around if something happens, especially computer related stuff. I do love a good swear and a good a good bit of cussing, but also that's different from swearing at someone. That's like verbally
yes,
abusing someone. That's a very different thing. I wouldn't
yes,
do that, nor would I want to be on the receiving end of that. That's not okay in my book. So
yeah, and it's also
yeah.
perfectly possible for somebody to verbally abuse somebody else without using any swear words. That's
Exactly.
about the tone and content.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so multi-layered. God, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to talk about or add that we haven't talked about yet?
Oh geez, I just have the entire range of human subject matters.
Yeah.
Uh, let's see. I can't think of anything.
Okay, that's fair enough. Just thinking if there's anything else really that I found or that jumped out at me. So you also you host a weekly radio show,
I
Philosophy
do.
Talk. Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Doesn't
I can talk about
and it,
philosophy talk. There is actually
yeah.
a connection to gender right now,
Oh,
because
yeah.
we just got a grant to do a series on 16 women philosophers in
Oh,
history.
interesting. Yeah.
And people have been emailing us and telling us how many women philosophers we have left out of the list of 16, because of course there have not been only 16 women philosophers in history. Those are just the ones that we've done shows on. But I
Yeah.
want to do more.
Mm,
So I also want
yeah.
to say something about our research director, Laura McGuire, who
Hmm.
did so much of the planning and grant writing for this project. Like,
Mm,
she's fantastic and deserves recognition.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So you say you're a practicing bisexual. Does that mean you are pretty much dating, like freely dating? Are you in a committed relationship? That doesn't necessarily exclude dating, I know. How is that for you at the moment?
Yeah, so I am polyamorous. I have all of the relationships I want right now, and I'm not
And
looking for more.
polysaturated.
Yeah, I'm polysaturated and very happy.
Amazing. I love that. Yeah, I had a sense that might be the case. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm very much at the beginning still of the whole polyamory journey. And
Ooh.
it is such a like, because people consider polyamory, they hear the word and they think, oh, you just want to have your cake and eat it, and oh, you get to have sex with lots of people. And it's like, seriously, that's not even the point. It's like it requires a certain level of emotional maturity, for one. If you don't have that, you're going to struggle with one relationship. You're going to struggle even more with more than one relationship, especially at the same time, you know? So there is that. And
Yes.
yeah, and also like I feel like I have learned so much though before even going to the field of, or like to this area of, having multiple relationships. I almost had to really go back to square one and to be like, what do I want? What do I need? How do I see relationships? And it's brought up loads of crap, from my, how I've always done relationships, how I was conditioned, how I was brought up as a woman, how I was, all that stuff is part of that mix. So yeah.
Yeah. No, so after my divorce, I had like a while of just celibacy and figuring myself out,
Mm,
which I really liked and kind of would encourage people to try.
mm.
And so that put me in a place where I could then kind of start fresh.
Yeah, like a
And
reset of sorts, maybe.
yeah, and then I had a
Yeah.
reset, and then I thought, well, trying to do monogamy actually stressed me out. Like people talk about monogamy like it is simple, and it
Mm,
wasn't simple for me. It wasn't really because I want to have sex with everybody I meet. I don't.
mm,
It was more that like there was always like this little bit of paranoia, like, am I cheating? Is the other person cheating? Do I have to monitor like what counts as cheating? And just having
mm,
a reset where I didn't do things that way anymore was
mm.
really freeing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I don't think I actually have had like a time, like a long period of time since then where I had exactly one partner. But I
Hmm.
think even if I did, like just not having to worry about that part of it would be really freeing.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting, like the exclusivity, really, because that's what
Yeah.
monogamy is about. So the exclusivity. But then, if you weren't exclusive, what else is there? And that's like a really like proddy, pokey, like triggering question, or potentially. But it is true. Like if you're in a dynamic with someone, what binds you? What not keeps you together? Like what connects you? Surely it's more than just being exclusive. And like why are
Yeah.
people so focused on that anyway? Like I feel like I just want the freedom to connect with people in any way that feels good. And if I'm not with my partner, what does it matter what else I do with other people? Surely if it makes me happy, I'm going to bring that energy back to our relationship?
Yeah, no, I
So,
agree. And I think like another piece of it for me is also sometimes what I want is to be by myself, and sometimes what I want
mhm.
is to not have sex. And if my partner sort of, if I'm their only source of like deep companionship and sex, that's a lot of pressure on me.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I feel like it helps people just be themselves and not. Um, I don't know if the word is people pleasing, not necessarily, but like having to live up to these expectations. And I think a lot of women as well are like they're just especially in the in the old days, like marital duties and all that rubbish. That you
Yeah.
look back on now and you think, really, was that a thing? But I think it's still the reality for a lot of people. Speaking from a privileged position in a Western country, being a white person, obviously that isn't a reality for a lot of women all over the world still. And
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading about sort of the history of like consent policies in the US for a
mm,
paper, and I learned a bunch of like fascinating and disturbing things. So a thing
mm,
that I had known before starting this is that uh, marital rape was only illegal in all 50 states starting in the 90s. I was
wow.
alive in the 90s. I was aware of the world around me in the 90s. That's
Mm-hmm.
my living memory.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also I learned of a person that I know just from like work contexts that she was integral in drafting the Antioch policy. I don't know if you're familiar with the Antioch policy.
No, what's
So
that?
this was a college policy drafted by a group of Antioch college students that was about consent, and it basically said consent has to be explicit, it has to be granular. So, like your prior sexual history or the fact that you consented to do something else doesn't mean you consent to this act.
Mm-hmm.
And so they put forth this policy. They pushed the administration actually into adopting a version of it, and they were widely ridiculed at the time. So
Wow.
like Saturday Night Live had like an episode making fun of them, and this is stuff that I take for granted about consent.
Mm.
And a person that I know had to push for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm.
that was just like very eye-opening to
I
me.
bet. Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like I love that it's becoming more of a talked about thing. Consent and nervous system stuff and how emotions and things get trapped in the body and how like trauma, and what counts like defining trauma, kind of like you were saying earlier about how do you define aggression? Like how do you
Yeah.
define trauma? And what is traumatic for one person is not necessarily for another person.
Yeah.
And it depends on like who you are as a person and maybe neurodivergence and sensitivity and all that kind of stuff has a part to play in that. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like we have a
Mm.
lot like as a culture we have a lot to sort of still figure out about how to take really good care of each other.
Mm,
And I
definitely.
I just like learning all this feminist history about feminist debates over consent has made me feel like we're so much better set up as a culture than we were as a teenager
Mm,
because of this group of activists that I'm just super grateful to.
hmm. Yeah, totally. Is there anything, I don't know, I've asked you already, but has anything else popped into your head that you might like to add before we wrap up?
So yeah, so any questions about the reading? I can't think of anything. Uh,
That's fair enough. Yeah. Do you expect to write any more books on the subject of gender or otherwise?
Definitely, I don't know, like I don't have a plan for a next book, and I'm thinking about writing some papers.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly about like nerdy philosophy topics. So one of the
Yeah.
one of the things that I'm writing about now is impossibilities and imagining impossibilities, which I think
Mm,
is related to
interesting.
the book insofar as it's
Yeah.
got to do with imagination and possibility. Uh,
Ooh,
it turns out that imagining impossibility is really important in scientific practice,
right.
where you have all these things like frictionless planes or like simplified models of how a system works that maybe
Mm,
don't conform to and maybe couldn't conform to the like whatever the actual laws of the universe are.
mm-hmm.
There are some philosophers of science who think like laws of nature are not even true. They're just kind of simplified modeling assumptions. So I should credit Nancy Cartwright as the main proponent of this idea. It is not a majority view in philosophy of science, but it's out there. So
Mm. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I think when you get into the level of like metaphysics and stuff like that and impossibility, I mean, is there this quote? And it says something along the lines of those who argue that it is impossible shouldn't interrupt those people who are just doing the thing, something like that. And that always amuses me because, yeah, I think we can be very restricted by our own preconceived ideas of possibility,
mhm.
but I think it takes something to be really entertaining ideas and like how because we don't necessarily understand how it could be possible, but just entertaining the idea that it's possible is enough of a spark to expand things around it. I don't know.
Yeah, so I
Words are
actually
hard.
think that
Yeah.
that this is the point that you just made is a slightly different point from the one I'm doing in the new paper, although it's really closely
Okay.
related to the book that we were talking about. So I think the book
Ah,
is all
yeah.
about having a more expansive view of what is possible because more things are possible than you think. But then I also think there are some things that are genuinely impossible, but that you want to think about and imagine anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of raises a little bit of a question about what do I mean by possible? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think the things that are worth imagining exist on both sides of the line between possible and impossible.
Mm.
And this is like one of the things that I want to hash out, whether there's like some such thing as really possible or whether there are just a bunch of different concepts of possibility, but none of them is the real possibility.
Yeah. Oh, this is so juicy. I feel like we could sort of nerd out about this for hours.
I teach an entire class about this.
Amazing. Oh my God. Yeah. Wow. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me on the podcast and spending the time talking to me too. Yeah.
Yeah. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Ray-Briggs, which is Briggs, where you can also read the transcript. Further links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media and on YouTube. Again, if you appreciate this podcast and want to support us, visit our website to make a donation, find out more about our allyship course and workshops, and details of how to join our community. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.